No one tells you this, but emotional distance doesn't start with conflict. It starts with exhaustion. Not the kind of exhaustion that comes from working too hard or staying up too late. This is something quieter. Something that builds slowly, like dust gathering on a shelf you stopped noticing years ago. You wake up one morning and realize you've even going through the motions with people you genuinely care about, and you're not entirely sure when that started happening. Maybe it's that phone call with your sister that used to feel easy but now feels like a checklist item. Maybe it's sitting across from your spouse at dinner, both scrolling through your phones, and neither of you can remember the last real conversation you had. Or maybe it's those friends you used to see regularly, and now, when you think about making plans, something in you just hesitates. Not because you don't love them, but because the energy it takes to show up the way you used to, it's just not there anymore. And here's the thing nobody mentions. You start feeling guilty about it. Like you're failing at relationships that used to come naturally. Like something's broken inside you that used to work just fine. But what if I told you that what you're experiencing isn't a personal failure? It's actually a predictable psychological shift that happens to most people after 50, and almost nobody talks about it openly. Here's what's really going on. By the time you reach your 50s, you've accumulated decades of emotional labor. You've shown up for people. You've listened to problems. You've given advice, offered support, celebrated victories, mourned losses. You've been the friend, the parent, the partner, the colleague, the sibling. You've carried other people's emotions alongside your own, sometimes without even realizing you were doing it. And your nervous system, it's tired. Not in a way that a good night's sleep can fix. It's tired in a way that makes you instinctively start protecting your energy. You begin, often unconsciously, to create distance. Not because you care less, but because you've spent so much of your life caring that you've run low on the reserves needed to engage the way you once did. This is where it gets interesting though. Most people interpret this distance as apathy or disconnection. They think something's wrong with them. But what's actually happening is your psyche is trying to recalibrate. It's trying to find a sustainable way to be in relationships without depleting yourself completely. Think about it this way. When you were 30, you could handle a demanding job, raise kids, maintain friendships, deal with family drama, and still have energy left over to be fully present with your partner at the end of the day. At 50 plus, that same equation doesn't add up anymore. Not because you're less capable, but because you've been running that equation for 20 or 30 years straight, and the accumulated weight of all that emotional output has finally caught up with you, and society doesn't help. We live in a culture that glorifies staying connected, being available, maintaining relationships, showing up. Nobody teaches you that it's okay and necessary even to step back and conserve your emotional resources. So when you start naturally doing exactly that, you interpret it as something being wrong with you, rather than something being right with your self-preservation instincts. Here's a small example that might sound familiar. Someone calls you, and you see their name on the screen. You love this person. You genuinely do. But instead of answering immediately like you used to, you think, I'll call them back later when I have more energy. And then later comes, and you still don't have that energy. Days pass. Now you feel worse because you haven't called back. The guilt compounds. The distance grows. Not because you stopped caring, but because you're trying to protect something in yourself that feels increasingly fragile. Or consider this. You're at a social gathering and someone's telling you a story. You're nodding, smiling, responding appropriately, but inside, you're just waiting for an acceptable moment to leave. You're not even present. You're conserving energy while appearing engaged, which is exhausting in its own way. And afterward, you feel relieved to be home, but also vaguely ashamed that you couldn't just enjoy being with people you actually like. This is what emotional disconnection looks like after 50. It's not dramatic. It's not even necessarily noticeable to others. It's this subtle withdrawal, this internal rationing of emotional resources that never needed rationing before. And here's what makes it even more complex. The relationships themselves haven't necessarily changed. The people in your life might be the same wonderful humans they've always been. The problem isn't them. The problem is that you've changed. Your capacity has shifted, and nobody prepared you for that. What's particularly cruel about this is that right when you need connection most, when you're dealing with aging, mortality, identity shifts, life transitions, your natural inclination is to pull back from the very relationships that could support you through those changes. It's like being thirsty, but being too tired to walk to the water. If you're recognizing yourself in any of this, I want you to pause for a moment and ask yourself, when did I last allow myself to admit that I am just tired of trying so hard in my relationships? Some of you watching this might benefit from knowing you're not alone in this. If that's you, a simple like lets me know this conversation matters to you, and honestly, it helps me understand what's resonating. Now, there's another layer to this that's worth exploring. Part of what makes emotional disconnection so pronounced after 50 is that you've also experienced enough loss and disappointment by this point to be more cautious with your emotional investments. You've had friendships end. You've been let down. You've given energy to relationships that didn't reciprocate. Your psyche has learned to be more selective, more protective. This isn't cynicism, it's wisdom. But it can feel like disconnection because you're no longer approaching relationships with the same open, unlimited availability you had in your 20s and 30s. There's also the reality that your life might look different now than it did before. Maybe your kids have grown and moved away, and the daily structure of parenting that kept you engaged and connected to a community is gone. Maybe you've retired, and the social network that came with work has dissolved. Maybe you've lost people, friends, parents, sometimes even a spouse, and the grief of that has made all relationships feel heavier somehow. When your life circumstances change, your emotional bandwidth changes with them. But we rarely acknowledge that. We just keep expecting ourselves to function at the same relational capacity we always did, regardless of what we're carrying. Something else that happens around this age. You start realizing that time is finite in a way you did unfully grasp before, and that realization makes you more conscious of where you spend your energy. You become less willing to engage in surface-level interactions. You want depth, or you want solitude. The in-between stuff, the small talk, the obligatory social events, the maintaining of friendships that don't really feed you, it starts feeling like a waste of precious time. So you withdraw. Not from everything, but from the things that don't feel essential. And sometimes people take that personally. They think you don't care anymore. But the truth is, you're just becoming more intentional about where you place your finite emotional resources. The irony, of course, is that this very intentionality can create exactly the disconnection you're trying to avoid. Because relationships require maintenance. They require showing up even when it's not convenient. They require energy even when you don't have excess to give. There's no easy answer to this tension. But I think there's something liberating in simply understanding what's happening, in recognizing that the emotional distance you're feeling isn't a character flaw. It's a natural response to decades of emotional output meeting the reality of aging and limited capacity. Maybe the question isn't how to fix this disconnection, but how to be honest about it. How to show up in relationships in a way that's sustainable rather than depleting. How to communicate your limitations without guilt. How to accept that you might not be able to be everything to everyone anymore, and that's okay. If this conversation is hitting home for you in a way that feels important, consider staying connected here. There's more to explore about this stage of life, the psychological shifts that happen, and how to navigate them without feeling like you're failing at being human. That's what we talk about in this space. The truth is, emotional disconnection after 50 isn't the end of meaningful relationships. It's an invitation to reconsider how you engage with them, to find a way of connecting that honors both your genuine care for others and your need to preserve something for yourself. Maybe you're not becoming emotionally distant. Maybe you're just finally learning to stop giving more than you can sustain. And maybe that's not disconnection at all. Maybe that's the beginning of the most honest connection you've ever had with yourself. And eventually, with the people who matter most. What if the exhaustion you've been feeling isn't a sign that something's wrong, but a sign that something's finally trying to balance itself out? Thanks for watching.